Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Forum on One Korea 2020 virtual series with the theme, Free and Unified Korea, Challenges and Opportunities Amidst the Dynamic US-China-Korea Relations. So this is one part of a forum series, the third one. And it's co-organized by the Global Peace Foundation, Action for Korea United, and the One Korea Foundation. So those organizations partnered, long-term partners in promoting international support for nuclear-free and Korean-led peaceful unification to uphold freedom, democratic values, rule of law, and human rights as an urgent, not a distant goal, based on the shared identities and cultural heritage of the Korean people. And for this particular forum today, so we'll bring a panel of esteemed experts from the United States, China, and Korea to examine the current status and trends of the dynamic US-China-Korean relations, where we'll mainly focus on potential opportunities amidst challenges to advance the agenda of free and unified Korea. And so we have also some commentators from different countries to give comments and ask questions as well. And so today, and of course, each person speak from their individual capacity, not necessarily representing the country government's view. And so people feel free to share your own thoughts. And so all the bios on our website, so we're not spending a lot of time to read bios. So you're welcome to go to the website to see the bios of our speakers today. And so we'll start quickly, just get into the welcome remarks. And first of all, I would like to welcome Mr. James Flynn, the International President of the Global Peace Foundation, to give welcome opening remarks. Jim, you need to unmute yourself. Okay.
Thank you, Victor. Greetings from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the third convening of the International Forum on One Korea 2020 virtual series. The Global Peace Foundation is proud to join with Action for Korea United and One Korea Foundation in organizing this important forum. Special thanks to Dr. Jae Ryu of the One Korea Foundation and Mr. Intek So of Action for Korea United for your important leadership in this collaborative effort. I also want to especially appreciate today's presenters and discussants who are contributing their valuable insights and expertise. And thanks to all the participants who are joining us today. At GPF, we believe that the challenges today on the divided Korean Peninsula pose the most serious threat to global peace and security. In seeking solutions, we advocate for a comprehensive framework that we call the Korean Dream approach that recognizes that the current division on the Korean Peninsula was never meant to be permanent, and that the aspirations of the Korean people call for a free and unified homeland, that the demand of the Korean people for self-determination must be honored. In other words, that the process of Korean unification must be Korean-led. That Korean unification should be based on ideals and principles drawn from Korea's ancient history and culture, affirming fundamental human rights for all. That such a Korean-led process requires significant international support. This forum builds on the previous convenings in this series held on August 15 and September 30. Today we address the theme, Free and Unified Korea, Challenges and Opportunities Amidst the Dynamic US-China ROK Relations. The challenges today are many. The resurgence of the pandemic is still ravaging the globe. US-China relations are currently strained to near breaking point, with South Korea buffeted by these two major powers. Meanwhile, DPRK reminded the world of its intent by showcasing its new ICBM at its recent military parade. We all know that challenges can also open new opportunities. Are there new avenues to pursue in this challenging geopolitical landscape? What are the fresh perspectives and strategies that can lead to new breakthroughs? We look forward to the insights shared by today's presenters and a robust and stimulating discussion on these key issues. Again, we greatly appreciate your participation in this important forum, and we hope that you will join us in ongoing efforts in support of the Korean dream for a free and unified Korea. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Flynn, for your consistent leadership in this effort. And our next welcome remarks will be given by Mr. Intek So. But as I remember, no, Mr. Intek So, you sent the video message. You want us to play that message, or you want to speak now spontaneously?
Yeah, play the message.
Okay, yeah. So Joseph, please, yeah, play that message.
Hello, distinguished guests, panelists, and partners. Thank you so much for your participation. On behalf of Action for Korea United, I really want to convey my heartfelt gratitude to all of you. In the midst of chaos the world today, the humanity is seeking the way forward. This is a time we should make a collaborative effort since the world is becoming closer and more connected than ever. Our destiny is tied. As you understand well, Korea was divided right after the liberation from Japan when the World War II was ended in 1945. The influence of foreign power to the peninsula with two sets of different ideologies took away the self-determined opportunities from Korean people. Their wishes to build a new unified and independent nation centered on the founding idea of the ancient Korea, 홍익인간, which means building a nation to benefit all humanity. This idea was deeply rooted in Korean people and its history. When there was an opportunity to come to build a new nation through independence, Korean people adopted the Western idea of modern government. Based on this idea, the new nation must be built upon 홍익인간 idea, also uphold the God-given fundamental freedom and human rights, and build a free and democratic nation, maintaining check and balance of power, governed by the rule of law. And this nation must be a nation benefit not only to each nation and region, but for all of the world by bringing peace and prosperity. This was our great dream, the Korean dream, but not yet fulfilled due to the division. So Korean dream has to be a vision for a unified Korea. The unification is an opportunity again for Korean people to build a new nation centered on Korean dream. So AKU is making effort to remind Korean people to have their dream again under the leadership of Dr. Hyunjin Pressemoon. AKU is doing various activities to empower ordinary citizens to have a dream of unification and make them contribute for its realization. Our grassroots effort is to focus not to lose the historic opportunity of unification in near future to come. I'm proud and glad that AKU with the Global Peace Foundation is convening this virtual international forum on One Korea again. I'm sure this effort today is another first step forward for peace for unification. As today's topic, intensifying US-China relation has a critical impact on Korean Peninsula. I want to listen to your opinion and wisdom with a great interest. Thank you so much once again for your participation. God bless you.
Thank you, Mr. Intek So, yeah, for your strong leadership in Korea, actually for this alliance of more than 800 NGOs. That's just, the wonderful leadership there. And then next will be Dr. Jae Pong Liu, the founder of One Korea Foundation. Dr. Liu.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of One Korea Foundation, a co-sponsor of this IFOK, International Forum on One Korea, I like to say a few words of appreciation for my fellow co-sponsors of Jim and Mrs. Intec. And I welcome you all, the 400 plus people who have registered for this conference, and also those who will be watching the proceedings later on. For a few years of conducting this IFOK, our vision has become clear. We want Korea, its peninsula, and its people to be united into one Korea. And we want this one Korea to be free, strong, prosperous, and is respectful of human rights and governed by rule of law. Now, the question here toward the end of year 2020 does this remain a viable dream? What are the obstacles if we try to accomplish this dream? If it's not so viable, how do we make it viable again? What are the challenges and opportunities? I believe these are the goals and hopes for this conference. I cannot help but thinking sometimes that the period we are living through is somewhat analogous to about the period of the world 100 years ago, mainly the interwar period, beginning in 1918 with the end of World War I and the start of Second World War, 1939. It both kind of started with a pandemic, the Spanish flu, 1918, that wiped out 18 million people, 1% of global population at the time. Although it is not so severe this time around, it is perhaps more global and perhaps more uncertain in terms of its future. The period is also full of the extremist ideologies led by a variety of populism. And that interwar period began with the rise of USSR. We are now witnessing the rise of PRC, People's Republic of China. And as we compare this period, what are the kind of challenges and obstacles we will have to examine? I wish to participate in the rest of the conference to get myself better education on this so that we can examine the new circumstances and explore some new opportunities. And as the program designers have pointed out, move a little closer to creation of a roadmap to a free and united Korea. Human beings have made great strides. We have created nearly perfect individuals and a great many social institutions and developed many human assisting technologies. And yet, when it comes to international relations, we have not moved very far from the Stone Age. We still operate in a very dangerous period. And how are we to create a new world order and issue of on the top of this new world order? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. For your great leadership. Actually, as a person you're born in North Korea and then it moved to South Korea and live in the United States for so long, but the unwavering desire and effort for free and unified Korea is so touching, and then really appreciate for your partnership working on this effort. And now, so we move to the main panel. We have 6 speakers, 2 from each country. And so let's first welcome Mr. Doug Bando, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, and to give you a presentation. Dr. Bando.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to participate. I appreciate the invitation. This is certainly an interesting time to be discussing the issue with a presidential transition here in the United States. and difficult relations in varying ways of the U.S. with all the major participants, China, the Republic of Korea, and North Korea. So I think we're facing some challenging times ahead of us. The objective of a one Korea became essentially on the division of the peninsula into occupation zones back in 1945. That's when the desire to bring Korea back together really started. It was a tragic division, though in retrospect, I think we can see it was the only way that could save at least part of Korea to be democratic and free and create the potential in the long term for what we hope will be a united, prosperous, and peaceful peninsula. Since then, of course, the peninsula has gone through an awful lot. Essentially its own mini Cold War between the North and South, also caught up within the larger Cold War of the United States and the Soviet Union. And within that, until 1972, a very difficult relationship between the PRC and the US. The North Korean component remains, I think, the toughest to deal with. The history, of course, dealing with the North, starts with the war itself. Kim Il-sung wanted reunification on his terms and sought to get it in 1950. Since then, the relationship has at times gone hot and then cooled off with occasional negotiations and summits as well. We're now in the throes of dealing with a North Korea with nuclear weapons. That we have said it should not have nuclear weapons, it has them, and the challenge is how to get the North to, number one, stop advancing on that front, and number two, how to get North to actually give them up and denuclearize. Kim Jong-un does seem a bit different from his father and grandfather. He is no liberal. This is a man who will not let anyone stand in his way of power. Nevertheless, he does seem more concerned about economic development and appears to enjoy international diplomacy. So there may be something there to work with in the future that we really lacked with Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung. The good news of, we had a Cold War, and which was very serious with the Soviet Union. It was involved, of course, in the war back in 1950. Thankfully, that's over. But of course, the US relationship with Russia, while started out warmer with the end of the Cold War, has gotten more difficult, certainly in recent years. And while Russia is not a major player in terms of Korea, it still matters and could play a more helpful role. I think the major concern that we face is a potential Cold War between the United States and China, which would be bad for many reasons. Obviously bad on its own terms for both the Chinese and American people, and bad as well for trying to resolve the problems on the Korean Peninsula. And we've seen in recent years with Beijing, tensions rising with the ROK, with the THAAD deployment, and then Chinese economic retaliation. Relations with North Korea and China have varied over the years, have gotten warmer, certainly in the last couple of years. And I think part of this plays into China's view of reunification. As long as China perceives that it is involved in a potential Cold War with the United States, I suspect that China will be more nervous at the notion of a united Korea if it is one allied with the United States and one which has US troops on the peninsula. It's worth remembering that that is, in fact, effectively what brought China into the war in 1950, was to prevent that very situation. And while the world is very different and China's interest in going to war, I think, is much less, nevertheless, it's hard to imagine Beijing being pleased with that possibility. So the state of US-China relations will matter, I think, a great deal. The question then is how to move forward. This new administration is going to have an awful lot to deal with. And I think that's going to be a challenge for anyone interested in international affairs. Going in, the biggest crisis will certainly be COVID. It's kind of exploding again all over the United States. The state of the economy as more places move back towards lockdowns. The U.S. budget, the U.S. is at the moment has more than 100% of GDP, debt to GDP. These numbers are going up staggering amounts. By 2050, the Congressional Budget Office thinks the United States could be at 150 or even 200% of GDP in debt. it's very hard to see how the US can manage a lot of foreign policy adventures with that kind of a debt load. And the challenge especially will be how to deal with North Korea, which is not known for its patience. North Korea does not want to be seen as being ignored. And I think that does create a potentially dangerous situation where we could see that large missile being tested, potentially some attempt, a provocative step to get Washington's attention. In terms of US ROK relations, this is an area where it strikes me that it would be helpful if the Biden administration did everything that it could to emphasize South Korean agency, that dealing with the North is most importantly an issue for South Korea. It obviously has the greatest impact on South Korea. Back in 2017, Lindsey Graham commented, well, a nuclear war in Korea wouldn't be so bad because, well, it would be over there. It would not be over here, as he put it. And that certainly did not cause my South Korean friends to feel very comfortable. The US needs to make very clear that ultimately the Korean issue is one for the Koreans, where the US can be helpful, but it is a Korean issue. And try to help South Korea, giving it options in terms of dealing with North Korea, opportunities to try to move forward with some potentially positive steps and work would be helpful. The dealing with North Korea, the president obviously has changed our dealings with North Korea, and I think he deserves credit for that. He was maladroit, as always, in terms of how he moved forward, though I think the idea of having a direct engagement with the North is something useful. It's worth kind of trying to move on that. The question then are conditions and under what circumstances. I would suggest that the Biden administration should start with what strikes me as very easy. Number one is ending the travel ban. I assume that Biden will get rid of the executive orders on travel, restricting travel to the United States. And I think with that, the US should drop restrictions on Americans going to North Korea. And the US also, to my mind, should push forward the idea of liaison offices. Diplomatic contact is not a reward. Diplomatic contact is what you need with adversaries. We paid a high price for not having any discussions with the Chinese prior to the Korean War. It would have been horrendous not to have been able to talk to the Soviets during the Cold War. So these are things I think could be offered to the North, showing a commitment to engage while recognizing there's much else that's going to be on the president's plate before he might be able to make a serious engagement offer. Nevertheless, that Kim should recognize the US is interested. An improved relationship with Russia would be helpful. That's a very large issue, of course. Nevertheless, to the extent that we could have the Russians more helpful on Northeast Asia, the better. China, I think, is the major issue. This one is huge. And again, it's huge on its own right, but it's also huge in terms of dealing with Korea. Obviously, anything that we can do to improve that relationship would be helpful. That's really a subject for another webinar. Nevertheless, if we're going to want Chinese cooperation and help, we've got to convince them that they will not be working against their interest. And to the extent that they think US policy encourages either a collapse of North Korea or a reunification on South Korea's terms allied with America with US troops, I think China is going to be very unlikely to push very hard on those kinds of issues. It sees an American attempt at containment in East Asia. Whether or not that's the right policy is irrelevant. From their standpoint, that's what they see. And we cannot assume that they will do anything that in their view would be helpful for that. So I think to the extent we can try to separate the Korean issue from the larger challenge of US-Chinese relations, for example, to indicate that reunification would result in a united Korea that would be neutral militarily, or a united Korea that would not have American troops. Think of ways to how to assuage Chinese concerns, that to be helpful on promoting a peaceful reunification would be against its own interests. I think that's something for the US and the ROK to think very deeply about. What is the way to draw China in a way that avoids connection to the ongoing difficulties with the United States? Will this work? Who knows? I think the critical issue here is it's in all of our interest to have a peaceful and a prosperous Korea. There have been a lot of divided nations around the world. Vietnam was divided for 21 years. It reunited in a very bloody fashion. Yemen was divided for about 27 years. It came back together in 1992 and has had a very unhappy time since then. Germany is the positive case. It came back together after 45 years in 1989. And that's one that I think people in Korea look to as the model. It's been 75 years and counting. So I think it's long overdue for the Korean people to be able to reunite, to chart their own future. It should be up to the United States and other countries in the region to assist Korea as it tries to move forward down that path. And I look forward to a day when we will see a reunited and prosperous Korea. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, Doc, for your very optimistic view. I think that's something that's exactly what we are looking for, and we want to work towards a free and unified Korea, even though we know there are many challenges. And you talk about travel ban, remove the travel ban. That's something you traveled to North Korea multiple times before. I hope you can fulfill that dream soon. And yeah, we can work together more on this efforts. Yeah. And our next is Dr. Joseph Bosco, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Korea America Studies and the former China Country Desk Director for the U.S. Department of Defense. Dr. Bosco.
Thank you, Victor. It's a pleasure to be with you and with some old friends as well. For decades, North Korea's growing nuclear weapons program has bedeviled one American administration after another. Bilateral negotiations, multilateral negotiations, agreed frameworks, six-party talks, imposition of sanctions, lifting of sanctions, threats, offers of economic incentives, all foundered into frustration and futility. Meanwhile, the Pyongyang regime moved inexorably forward, not only with menacing nuclear weapons, but also with short-range, medium-range, and long-range missiles to deliver them. They could reach targets in South Korea, Japan, US bases in Asia, and eventually Hawaii and indeed the mainland of the United States. Then in 2016, a brash New York real estate developer named Donald Trump, with absolutely no experience in government or foreign policy, arrived on the scene and ran for president, promising to cut through the feudal diplomatic tangle. He said he'd be willing to meet with Kim Jong-un, just as Barack Obama, when he first ran, said he would meet with Kim Jong-il. But Trump also said, quote, "I will put a lot of pressure on China because economically we have tremendous power over China. People don't realize that. China can solve that problem with one meeting or one phone call." At one point, he called Kim a maniac, but also expressed respect for his toughness in consolidating his power, such as by having his relatives killed. Quote, "This guy doesn't play games," he said, "and we can't play games with him." Obama told Trump that North Korea's nuclear program was the most dangerous national security challenge he would face in his first months in office. That warning proved accurate. Over the next several months, North Korea greeted the new president by conducting a series of medium-range missile tests and detonated a nuclear device that Pyongyang said was a hydrogen bomb. Soon, Trump and Kim were trading highly personal insults and threats, including who had the bigger nuclear button. Trump then launched what he called his maximum pressure campaign to convince Kim he would be safer without his nuclear weapons than with them. The objective was the same one that had preoccupied earlier administrations: complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, CVID. There were three components of Trump's maximum pressure campaign: economic sanctions, the danger of a military attack, and the threat of regime change in North Korea. The United States and the international community had been imposing economic sanctions off and on since 2006. But now Washington increased its own sanctions significantly and pressed the United Nations to do the same. They took a heavy toll on North Korea's economy and on the elite institutions that supported the Kim regime. The second element of the maximum pressure campaign was the threat to use force, what Trump called fire and fury, and his explicit threat to totally destroy North Korea. The rhetoric was pretty extreme, but it attained credibility because no American official, let alone the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the world, had ever used such violent language. National Security Advisor McMaster publicly raised the specter of a cataclysmic war. But it was more than rhetoric. The Trump administration began launching missiles at targets in the East Sea at the same time North Korea test-fired its missiles and reoriented the flight paths of bomber aircraft exercising within striking distance of North Korea. The missions were the most effective in at least 5 years because they did prompt Kim's military to modify its positioning. The third component of Trump's maximum pressure campaign was the psychological warfare factor. The prospect of fomenting a domestic upheaval within North Korea and an international effort to bring about the end of the Kim regime in Pyongyang. It wasn't made explicit, but it was accomplished by a series of major Trump speeches and White House events. In September 2017, the president delivered a speech to the United Nations where he said, quote, "The depraved regime in North Korea is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and the oppression of countless more," unquote. 2 months later, the president addressed the South Korean National Assembly, where he continued the drumbeat of the Kim regime's unfitness to govern because of its atrocities and human rights abuses. He described in detail the horrible working and living conditions in what he called the prison state of North Korea. Finally, in his State of the Union address in January 2018, Trump again referred to the depraved character of the North Korean regime and demonstrated it in the most human terms by describing the criminal murderous treatment of American student Otto Warmbier, who was returned to the United States after imprisonment and torture in North Korea, only to die days later. He then featured a disabled North Korean defector, tears streaming down his face, defiantly waving his cane in the air as the United States Congress gave him a standing ovation. A few days later, Trump hosted a White House meeting with a group of North Korean escapees who told their horror stories of life and death in North Korea. By now, the message to the world was clear. The Kim regime was so inhuman and unfit to rule North Korea, and Pyongyang could see the handwriting on the wall. In February, Kim began sending signals that he was ready to talk, such as by sending his sister to the Winter Olympics in South Korea. In March, the US and North Korea announced that Trump and Kim would meet to discuss denuclearization and other issues between the two countries. At that point, Xi Jinping stepped into the situation before it could get out of hand and summoned Kim to Beijing to meet for their very first time. After that meeting, North Korea's tone toward the United States noticeably hardened. When Trump and Kim had their historic meeting in June in Singapore, Kim agreed in theory to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but without offering any helpful specifics. Kim met with Xi 3 more times before meeting again with Trump, this time in Hanoi in February 2019. But by now, China had toughened Kim's position so that his position was beyond anything Trump could accept, and the meeting ended abruptly without even a joint statement. What had happened to end what had seemed a productive meeting of the minds between Kim and Trump to make real progress on denuclearization and to give North Korea substantial relief from economic sanctions? What happened was China and Xi's intervention. For decades, the West has bought Beijing's assurance that it shared Western concerns about North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Henry Kissinger was the foremost American figure who consistently gave this message to successive US administrations. Yet the evidence to the contrary was plain to see for those willing to see it. For one thing, China had been involved in North Korea's initial efforts to obtain nuclear materials and technology using the AQ Khan network in Pakistan. Furthermore, each time the United Nations considered imposing tough sanctions on North Korea, China, working with Russia, either opposed them or watered them down so significantly that they could not achieve their objective of changing North Korean behavior. Then, even after the weakened sanctions were imposed, China subverted and undermined them so that North Korea could survive and still keep its nuclear and missile programs intact. Why did China do this? Even as Kissinger and other experts kept saying that China opposed the programs. The answer is that China actually welcomed the programs. They worked to its strategic advantage by giving Beijing huge leverage over the US and the West. They enabled it to play the role of good faith negotiating partner and responsible stakeholder. North Korea was a huge diplomatic distraction and diversion of resources for the West, taking our eyes off China's own malign activities on trade, the South and East China Seas, Taiwan, human rights, and other issues. Whenever the West was about to crack down on China, the experts objected because, quote, we need China's help on North Korea. But of course, China never delivered. So now the West is confronted by two existential threats from nuclear-armed North Korea and China. It is time for the United States to return to Trump's maximum pressure campaign. Except that now Washington and its Western allies must recognize that North Korea will never denuclearize as long as China wants it to keep its weapons and missiles as a useful distraction. The Trump administration has known of China's pivotal role for some time. That was why it imposed secondary sanctions on China. In the next year, those sanctions on China need to be significantly increased. But more fundamentally, the world will have to come to grips with the reality that the ultimate solution to both the North Korea and the China problem, if those regimes will not change their behavior, is for the regimes themselves to be changed. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo indicated this was the necessary outcome for Beijing during his speech at the Nixon Library in June. He called upon the international community to cooperate with the Chinese people to encourage political reform. He acknowledged this would not be an easy task, but neither was ending the tyrannical and threatening rule of the Soviet Union. But it was accomplished peacefully, and it can be done with communist China over time if Western countries cooperate in getting the truth, the West's most powerful weapon, to the people of China, just as was done with the peoples of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Without the support of communist China, North Korea will have to come to terms with the West, as Kim appeared to be ready to do under Trump's maximum pressure campaign, until China intervened to pull him back. It is time to return to that point with both China and North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bosco, and for your wonderful presentation, and then for you apparently recognize more the challenges, and then also on the maximum pressure, and then regime behavior change, political reform, all those points. Yeah, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Dr. Huiyao Wan, the founder and president, Center for China and Globalization. So Dr. Wan.
Okay, thank you, Victor. First of all, I'd like to thank the Global Peace Foundation, the Action for Korea United, and also One Korea Foundation. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in this. I think it's a timely and very meaningful discussion. Of course, I see a lot of there's a lot of trust to be built, a lot of misunderstandings still remain, but I would like to present my view from a think tank point of view. So I'm not representing any government position, but just to observe from a think tank. I think surely the Korea Peninsula has played a geographically, strategically important role in East Asia as a bridge of or gateway between the Eurasia continent and the Pacific Ocean due to its geographic position. So by sharing a long border, actually, China and Korea have had a relationship for more than 2,000 years. Although it contains turns and twists, China-Korea relationship keeps healthy in general in a long history. China has enjoyed the increasingly growing economic and diplomatic relation with Republic of Korea since 1992, when China and the ROK established normalization of its relationship. I remember that the ROK President Kim Dae-jung and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea DPRK leader Kim Jong-un could actually sit down at a table to talk, to take the first step towards Korean unification with the Chinese help, actually also other helps, at the two Korean summit talk in Pyongyang in year 2000. Also due to the good relation China had with both North Korea and South Korea. So I've never doubted that when the two Korea unified, it would increase Korea's political and economic strength. You see, South Korea is an OECD member, the 10th largest GDP in the world, and the third is per capita income ranking in the world, actually, in just 2019. On the other hand, North Korea is very rich in natural resources, containing the great bulk of all known material deposits, where estimated that some 200 minerals are of economic value, including rare earth minerals, was estimated up to US 10 trillion as per South Korea projection reported by Quasar in 2017. So you see, a unified Korea would be an economic powerhouse because it would have a population around 77 million, and its total GDP could reach over 2 trillion in 2020. So in addition, the unification would give a land bridge to the Eurasia continent, and unified Korea would finally develop into a major hub for the new Eurasia continent economic corridor, generating significant economic benefit, not only for the nations in the Eurasia, but also for the global economics. However, at the present, there is a lot of opposition among the public and the policymaker in ROK due to the massive economic disparity between North Korea and South Korea, which is a long-term obstacle to unification. I think a regional integration of this new China, Korea, Japan corridor would help to stimulate economic development in North Asia and also in North Korea, and narrow down the gap. So economic is really fundamental, important to this region. A trilateral, actually, China, Japan, Korea, FTA can also take into account. Moreover, since China announced the revitalized Northeast policy in 2002, China has developed its links to Korea Peninsula, stimulating the trade and economic growth both for China and the Korea Peninsula. So according to the some studies, that China has actually had a lot of collaboration between South Korea, Korea, and North Korea, and for its Northeast China. So this idea of a North Asian economic integration is very important to ensure that we have a trade and investment and economic prosperity from mutually assured of dependency rather than mutually assured destruction. So the economic and the peace situation on Korea Peninsula is both influenced by a wider regional dynamics as well as the influence in the regional environment. Economy and peace on Korea Peninsula cannot be considered, I think, outside the wider North Korea, North Asian, and also indeed a global context. So in that context, I have to say, if you look at the planet where we all live now, our world is really at a turning point. I mean, now the pandemic has been swept around the world and the direst economic and social implication for all humankind. So globalization is under siege. Economic integration is under siege. We wonder what the future will hold and how Korea unification can find a way forward while facing all those challenges, also due to the absence of relevant multilateralism, also at unilateralism and country first, this kind of attitudes as well. So meanwhile, I think the nuclear problem that depends on the future of Korea Peninsula and also the whole world also be another challenge actually for Korea unification. However, the lifting of the sanctions on North Korea requires a consensus of China, of course, US, and of course, Russian and all the countries involved. And the US, as 3 of the 5 permanent members of UN Security Council, while, and also, the US, China, and other 3 members, of course, Russia included, we should really work together. While China and Russia have pushed for easing of the sanctions, the United States remains opposed to the absence of concrete denuclearization measures. This also impacts South Korea's ability to carry on inter-Korean projects. So the spectrum of issues involved will therefore require multilateral collaboration, cooperation, and coordination so that we can really make sure that both Korea and particularly North Korea can be really follow those international consensus. So a multinational framework is really important so that we can give each other a voice and also a stake in shaping the outcome of the peace process. I think now with the possible new Biden administration, we probably could have a new start. We could really have all multilateral efforts as President-elect Biden prefer, probably multilateral approach. So I think the pandemic and the nuclearization highlight the need for multilateral cooperation. So it's really pleased to see that just recently, last week over the weekend, at 15 Asian states and including countries in Australia and New Zealand that concluded the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership (RCEP), where South Korea is already in there, Japan is in there, China is in there. So RCEP will create a new momentum of regional integration for this most populous trade area in the world, which Asia will lead the world in terms of future economic growth. And as a matter of fact, at APEC summit just today, President Xi actually expressed that China is willing to consider to join CPTPP. So I would say that if we can really keep the peace and the trade and economic integration of the region, so we can make sure that, as I said, from mutually assured dependency to really avoid mutually assured destruction. So it's very stimulating to see this regional multilateralism is really happening. So unfortunately, I think for the last several years, I mean, we see that there's some efforts being tried from Trump administration to really try to reach the deal, but it's really a unilateral probably approach. That doesn't really work that well, and so it's really we should really invite all the countries concerned to really participate in this process. So as I said, assuming that Biden takes the office in January 20th. So I think probably we could, look forward to a new approach that President-elect Biden could probably, bring to the new the initiative. So we'll see if that can make some differences. So I really hope that it is time for the United States and also to reassert its leadership probably in this efforts that we can also together with China and other countries to provide an alternative to this peaceful solving process. So maybe probably it's time that we should revitalize the strategic dialogue between US and China. So North Korea issues can be talked through the bilateral talks and regular communication, so that we can get really more consensus, more focused, coordinated approach. Also, of course, I think those regional multilateralism, we should also encourage them to happen, such as the East Asian Summit, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, which is happening as well, ASEAN Regional Forum, and ASEAN Defense Minister meetings and things like that. So I think, there could be many areas to get involved, to really all focus on these issues, so that we can make sure countries like Korea, South Korea, North Korea are all involved. As a matter of fact, we had some positive experience in the past. Like the 6-party talks established Northeast Asian peace and security mechanism, and also made some progress on the nuclear issues in the Korea Peninsula. Of course, that somehow couldn't continue. So I think that some countries actually at times expressed a desire to restart the talks, and so there has been so far little progress towards this. This initiative, and there's a lack of political will probably to make it happen. But I think that probably 6-party talks could be revisited, or maybe we can reinitiate, so that we can make sure that this really can be revitalized. So to finish, I mean, on a long view, we really have to build a mutual trust. I think that is fundamental. If we don't talk, if we don't have meetings, this pandemic also keep us more strangers, even more so. There's no way we can work things out. So we have to really, build up the trust and have more bilateral meetings, multilateral meetings, so that we can really work very hard together and for openness and peace, cooperation, so that we can preserve the progress that we have made so far, and we can make sure Korean Peninsula is a nuclear-free peninsula. So that's the end of my talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, for your wonderful talk, and also for your ongoing interest and effort in this area. And so for your recognition of those benefits of unification and regional integration of Northeast Asia region, and multilateral collaboration for these efforts, and keep talking. That's for all the organizers. We promote this kind of engagement. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wang. And our next speaker is Dr. Feng Zhu, professor and dean of the Institute of International Studies at the Nanjing University. Dr. Zhu, your turn.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee, for inviting me to join such a very excellent panelist for a very timely topic on the China-US-Korean relations and its implications to the denuclearization and the unifications in Korean Peninsula. My point is very simple. So if you could know some, we say, the Chinese history and the Korean history, then usually then we say such a formality of historical elements could just tell us a lot. If we just trace back the past nearly not just 2,000 years, at least 1,000 years, every time the Korean unified and even strong, then it was a big addition to the Chinese national security and the Chinese integrity. So China's basic interest to the Korean Peninsula is we love to see a unified and a prosperous and a strong Korean, because our relations has never been so, intimate when the Koreans just, become strong and unified. Such a formula also works well in the modern history. So why China was just has forcefully put into a Korean War? It's just that because the geographical division between the Soviet bloc and the American bloc. So today, a lot of Chinese scholars and observers just like me, we still feel it was a great tragedy for China just being, we say, forced step into the Korean War. So then, if we look back to the past 3 decades, then we see such a historical formality is really echoing a lot on the Chinese view and the Chinese approach to the Korean. So when Deng Xiaoping, the former Chinese top leader, decided to, normalize relations with Seoul, then Kim Il-sung also made the quick trip to Beijing and just trying to block the Beijing from just officially normalizing the relations with Seoul. But Deng Xiaoping's response was very stuck and also very consistent. We would like to normalize relations with Seoul, and because it will be help a lot for China to integrate economically, and socially, and politically into the world community. Then Deng Xiaoping also very strongly and also very apparently just trying to persuade the Kim Il-sung. So North Korea's future is follow the China's case, open up and reform. Then it's only the way the North Korean could just re-win some sort of a strength and integrity. But unfortunately, DPRK didn't want to just follow the China's case because they consider if they follow the China's case, then they will just lose legitimacy representing the 2 Koreans. But over the time, then we will see the China's Deng Xiaoping's doctrine still, very, important on how to Korean just become one. I mean, the Chinese model. It's some sort of very easy and workable and operable way to get the 2 Koreans just reunified in a very peaceful and even just a costless, the methodology. But unfortunately, while the first North Korea's nuclear crisis happened, it's because the senior Bush administration believed North Korea was orphan because they was some equally just abandoned by Russia and China. So if the US could still insist on isolation and the handable policy vis-a-vis the North Korea, then North Korea will just quickly get into the collapse. But who was right, who was wrong? Then we have to say the main reason of the eruption of the first North Korea nuclear crisis back to in 1993 and then in 1994 was Americans some sort of very stubbornness in American supremacy handling the world affairs in the post, we say the Cold War era. Then another case we can easily figure out, getting back to the 2003, why the DPRK also would like to just declare its withdrawal from the NPT treaty, and also would like to just push on or tap on their renuclearization, formality. It's just because the junior Bush administration declared DPRK was the member of axis of evil. Of course, such an unbelievably tactless and wrongful, the handling of the DPRK, and threw the Korean Peninsula into the bigger disarray. Then it's the China stood out. Then we call on the 6-party talk. Then fortunately, then we will see Beijing and Seoul also cooperated very well. Then we will see it's a demolition of the, cooling tower back to 2007 and 2008. But why 6-party talk? Also just went into some sort of such an abortion. Reason is also simple. The Lee Myung-bak government came to the power. It's a conservative regime and they really hate the DPRK, and they consider just aligning with the United States. DPRK also could be crashed very relentlessly. Then we also see there's a couple of events happen. Then some sort of, such a warship collision or some sort of warship, the thinking, also that just to get the DPRK feel totally irritated because they consider US and the conservative Seoul government will not allow the DPRK just to move into any peaceful transition. Then Obama administration declare it's some sort of a new formula, strategic patience. Okay, then we will see the third generation of the DPRK government also just feel that's the only way for them to survive. It's just to stand up against Americans' intimidation and the source some sort of a reckless, crash down, the conspiracy vis-a-vis the DPRK. But China still sidelined. And we're watching, and we're also thinking, what's the way the DPRK could be integrated into the South Korean, and the one Korean unification could be successfully achieved at the end. What China did? We support the UN Security Council, and also just attacking some sort of a horrible policy sanction the DPRK. Then where we see DPRK is got just increasingly isolated and weakened. But unfortunately, it's a breaking point to the side. Then the Trump administration believe it's some sort of US-Korean summit meeting could totally and unbelievably change and reverse the trajectory because Kim Jong-un could be brought into the deal in front of President Trump. Unbelievably, it's a still restaging of the stupid story. President Trump did his dream of bringing the DPRK down, kneel down to the United States. Then another very, very bad thing is we say the Moon Jae-in government is some sort of progressive government. Looking back at Kim Dae-jung and Lee Moo-hae, every time a progressive government came to the power, the two Korean relations also eventually improved a lot. Then some sort of, we say, such a détente or some sort of good, the engagement between the two Koreans also could be very expectably just came into the sight. But why? Lee Moo-hae government so far fell in short of some sort of such a significant engagement. The reason is the Lee Moo-hae government don't want to just return the DPRK little by little, step by step, get to the DPRK could just aging toward openness to China, to Korean, and to the world. Then our American friend is still just very reminiscent to communist China. Today, China is communist. China is fully capitalist. Don't be so fully and so silly to still complain China is communist. China's domestic transition has not been finished yet, but the problem is we consider DPRK's reunification into the South Korean is the only way the Korean Peninsula could be what? Could be helpful, could be peaceful, and become a big addition to the Chinese security and the Chinese safety. But the problem is, looking back the past 2 decades, it's always some sort of policy swing so tremendously between the two sides. One is getting tougher to the DPRK, bringing it on. Another one is we can also seducing the DPRK into some sort of a threat. That kind of the swing strategy eventually proved to be failed. Okay, now the President Biden will be coming into the power soon. What kind of some sort of a really workable and we say operable approach could be just merged into some sort of multilateral one. Just absorbing all some sort of good willingness to resolve the DPRK issue. I don't know what will be a former trajectory, but at least for the time moment, a couple of the policy elements deserve reconsideration. One is DPRK issue in terms as finalize the solution. There will be some sort of regional endorsement. No one could be just naively think DPRK could be resolved simply by the US and by the South Korean. The reason is DPRK issue from the beginning is a regional security hot point. Any solutions should be through the regional endorsement. Second, I really appreciate the progressive governments of Seoul could just keep the DPRK raising arms. Looking back at Kim Dae-jung and Lee Moo-hin, why their policy is really worked to get the DPRK well moved and well touched. Get the DPRK as your what? Your fellow. You are Koreans. Don't just still very hostile to the DPRK. Look at some sort of a new humanitarian disaster now is happening in the DPRK, and the more Koreans in the north still stop the days. I really hope our Korean people be sympathetic, be patriotic, be humanitarian to your fellow. Last one. Yeah. Don't just resting on your prejudice. China is not communist China. Mr. Pompeo's some sort of a conspiracy theory of just calling on the Chinese people to stand against the Communist Party, unbelievably, is really historical joke. He really know what the China is at the last. China is not communist. DPRK is not a Kim Jong-un's DPRK. South Korean is not Kim Dae-jung's South Korean. We needed to jump into the new historical point where we should just share some sort of our conviction. We're totally indispensable, keeping the region as well as the Korean Peninsula in some sort of bigger chunk. We should work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhu, for your very comprehensive and full review of the history of the situation, especially for recognizing a unified and prosperous Korea is in the interest of China's long-term interests, and then also for the approach of working together with the regional endorsement. And thank you, Dr. Zhu. And our next speaker is Dr. Tae-Hwan Kwok, visiting chair professor at the Kyungnan University and former president of Korea Institute for National Unification. Dr. Kwok.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be here with you. I will discuss three key issues. Without resolving these issues, there will be no Korean unification. The three key issues I selected, first, the end of the Korean War declaration issue. Second, Chairman Kim Jong-un's conditional denuclearization issue. Third, South Korea's policy choice amid US-China strategic competition. Finally, I will conclude my presentation by making a few policy suggestions. First, let me discuss the end of war declaration issue. President Moon and Chairman Kim agreed to end of war declaration at the first Inter-Korean Summit in Panmunjom in April 2018. Recently, through video keynote speech at the 2020 UN General Assembly, President Moon emphasized that the, quote, Korean War must be completely and permanently ended now, unquote. He also stressed that the end of the war declaration would open the door to deadlocked nuclear talks and the way to the permanent peace regime. In my view, it is desirable first to consider Moon's proposal as first step in the roadmap for the Korean peace process. The end of the war declaration is necessary before concluding peace treaty or peace agreement. The two Koreas agreed to the end of war declaration signed by the 3 or 4 parties, United States, China, and the two Koreas. China has, I understand, officially supported the end of war declaration. However, the Trump administration remains indifferent to the proposal. Washington prefers peace declaration to the term the end of war declaration. It seems that Washington is in no hurry to sign peace declaration. There are two reasons. First, the US calls for visible progress in North Korea's denuclearization before signing peace declaration. Second, Washington fears that Pyongyang would demand reduction or withdrawal of US forces from Korea. I have favored multilateral end of war declaration and the 4-party peace treaty that are more binding than the bilateral declaration. In other words, US, China, and the two Koreas must sign end of war declaration first before concluding 4-party peace talks later. Let me now look at the Chairman Kim's conditional denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. As you know, North Korea is now de facto nuclear state. It appears that the Pyongyang will not give up nuclear weapons without achieving 2 conditions. First, withdrawal of US policy, hostile policy. Second, guarantee on the North Korean system. Many people are not aware of Kim's 2 conditions. Kim said that if he assures North Korean system survival, there is no need to have nuclear weapons. However, he clearly stated that he has no choice but to strengthen nuclear deterrence to the highest level by, quote, self-defense, unquote, measures to survive North Korean system under current security environment. Therefore, Washington must understand that international sanctions and the pressures cannot persuade Kim to give up nuclear weapons. As the highest dignity of North Korea, Kim Jong-un promised that he would give up nuclear weapons if only 2 conditions are met. At this point, Washington needs to consider at least one of the 2 conditions. Moreover, due to the domestic and the international factors, Kim is under high pressure to change to denuclearization and peaceful coexistence. The two factors would affect his decision to continue denuclearization. First, Kim Jong-un has gained confidence with the nuclear arms and wants to deal with the United States. He promised nuclear abandonment in exchange for the two conditions. Second, North Korea's economy is seriously deteriorating due to the international sanctions and COVID-19 pandemic. It seems that Kim now understands that the nuclear weapons he has cannot coexist with economic growth and prosperity. Therefore, I like to urge Washington consider Kim's proposed two conditions very seriously. Third issue I will discuss is the South Korea's policy choice amid US-China hegemonic competition. The competition between two is getting severe and worse as the armed conflict is growing in South China Sea. Many people here in Korea are very concerned about ROK involvement in unwanted war. The Trump administration plans anti-China NATO-like security organization. The Quad Security Alliance in the Indo-Pacific, including US, India, Japan, Australia, will form new NATO-like security network. Trump administration wants South Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand to join it. However, it is not sure that the new administration under Biden would pursue Trump Quad Plus plan. Vietnam has already declared balanced diplomacy toward the US and China. Will South Korea participate in new anti-China security organization? In my opinion, Seoul needs to maintain balanced diplomacy, which South Korean conservative governments in the past also pursued. My argument is based on the following reasons. First, Korean Peninsula geopolitically is located at the intersection of maritime and continental powers. Therefore, ROK must seek the best choice, pragmatically transcending ideology and alliance. Second, Seoul needs to strengthen US ROK alliance and maintain at the same time strategic partnership with Beijing to promote its interests. Third, China's role in resolving Korean issues is as vital as that of the United States. Suppose Seoul is in line with Washington, Beijing is likely to maintain hostile relationship with Seoul, thus endangering its security interest. In the final analysis, Seoul balanced diplomacy is not a matter of choice that some have demanded ROK to choose either United States or China. Seoul should not select either one. Neither Washington nor Beijing should force ROK to choose their sides. Finally, I will make a few policy suggestions. We need to learn lessons from past nuclear negotiations. I'd like to urge new administration under Biden to consider following suggestions. First, there has been no agreement on the definition of Korean denuclearization among United States, DPRK, and ROK. The three parties need to agree on the definition and roadmap for denuclearization peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. Second, Washington and Pyongyang are willing to compromise and make mutual concessions. The US and North Korea need to show their sincerity and strong will to negotiate over their respective positions and approaches to the nuclear issue. Third, Pyongyang and Washington need to refrain from sending each other's hostile signals. Pyongyang continues refraining from nuclear and long-range missile tests. Washington and Seoul also need to refrain from their joint military exercises with the strategic weapons around the peninsula. I sincerely hope the new administration under Biden need to consider these suggestions. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kwok, for your very comprehensive analysis on the three issues, as well as very concrete recommendations, to especially the United States government. Thank you very much. Next speaker is Dr. Ki-Young Song, Senior Research Fellow at Institute for National Security Strategy. Dr. Song.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts with our distinguished guests here in East Asia and the United States and beyond. Today, I would like to talk about imminent tasks in the long journey of the Korean reunification and about more practical conditions based on which the Korean people can ultimately pursue unified Korea in our generation. In doing so, I would like to focus on how to seek the peaceful settlement of the current issues on the Korean Peninsula. First of all, what I would like to emphasize is that we need to acknowledge the past North Korea policy by the United States, China, and South Korea all failed to bring about a desired outcome. Maximum pressure did not work as intended, and maximum engagement failed to find its momentum to be implemented as a result. One of the key factors that explains the failure of the maximum pressure campaign is, frankly, China's involvement to unofficially support the North Korean economy. As long as China opens a backdoor to North Korea, the full implementation of any denuclearization agreement cannot be completed. With regard to the US-China relations we are talking about, while the strategic rivalry between the two superpowers continues in East Asia, North Korea will try to make full use of the competition in order to maximize their strategic gain from each side. In other words, even if the United States and the DPRK reaches an interim agreement in terms of denuclearization and or peace regime building, we still need to secure US-China cooperation to make the agreement sustainable. If the Korean Peninsula peace process is stuck in this East Asia geopolitics, we will see little progress in seeking the permanent peace regime in the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, the US-China relations is going to be a decisive factor in the Korean Peninsula peace process and our journey toward Korean reunification. But the point I want to make is, among many conflictual issues in East Asia between the two superpowers, United States and China, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula can be regarded as an issue where the superpowers can find out a common ground. For example, South China Sea and Taiwan issues are vital or at least core interest for China whereas human rights abuse in Hong Kong and Xinjiang Uyghur is to do with the Biden administration's key tenets that the Democratic Party president in the United States cannot ignore. Taiwan and South China Sea conflicts are related to the hegemonic power transition in East Asia. In contrast, Washington and Beijing both agrees the necessity of the disarmament of the North Korean nuclear program and non-proliferation. There are also a series of global issues such as climate change, cybersecurity, and so on that are considered to be common ground for cooperation rather than competition between China and the new Biden administration. So what we need to do is put the Korean Peninsula peace process together with these common ground issues between the United States and China. Even if we assume that the Biden administration comes back to East Asia as a regional hegemon or a rule provider, it is still questionable for Washington to play the role of the sole problem solver in dealing with North Korea problem. On the other hand, if we are able to have China in the negotiation table of the Korean Peninsula peace process, it will result in putting pressure on North Korea not to resume a provocative behavior, at least while the multilateral dialogues continue. The multilateral negotiation framework is also useful for the responsibility distribution in designing and implementing a security architecture on and around the Korean Peninsula. So we can think about figuring out a new pattern of negotiation framework, such as four-party talks involving the two Koreas and the United States and China. This framework should tackle not only technologically define the denuclearization process, but also a sustainable security assurance regime in the Korean Peninsula. We have past experience of four-party talks in the late 1990s, but the four-party talks back then came to an end after several meetings from 1997 to 99 without producing any meaningful agreements. But there was fundamental limitation that explains the setback and failure in the process and result of the four-party talks at the time. The four-party talks was not proposed with strategic and meticulous calculation and preparation. It was rather hastily proposed for the purpose of creating US-ROK, a joint agenda, in the situation that only the US-DPRK negotiation track works after the Geneva Agreement, sidelining the then Kim Young-sam administration. North Korea also did not show enough attention to the four-party talks. North Korea is more interested in digging up a direct channel with the United States. There was a discrepancy too in setting the priority of negotiation. The United States and the ROK wanted to start off the deal by tackling trust building process incrementally, but North Korea insisted that the withdrawal of the US troops from the Korean Peninsula and the signing of the peace treaty should be the priority of the negotiation. But now, the United States and North Korea have many experiences to engage each other through a working level diplomatic channel over the last couple of years, although the key decisions have been made by the top-down diplomacy. So there will be no need to claim the creation of the direct channel between Washington and Pyongyang. What is needed at this moment is a commitment to assurance of action to action. In this sense, the multilateral framework will be a very important vehicle to guarantee this commitment. For example, the sanction alleviation and diplomatic normalization between the United States and the DPLK requires guarantee for North Korea's concrete steps for the denuclearization measures. In this situation, China can be a guarantor to forcefully implement North Korea's denuclearization commitment. In order to make this happen, more complex diplomacy in a multilateral framework should be kicked off with the start of the Biden administration. So I think now is the time to depart from mythical belief of top-down diplomacy led by Donald J. Trump to the real chance that let the diplomacy works. Another point I want to make today is human rights of North Korean people. We are supposed to talk about free and unified Korea, but very few people mentioned about freedom of the unified Korea. What I mean by freedom is not only freedom from political suppression, but also freedom from hunger and starvation of the North Korean people. Together with consistent efforts for the denuclearization of North Korea, we will need to pay equal attention to the livelihood of the people in the country from humanitarian point of view. Humanitarian assistance includes many different areas of cooperation between North Korea and the outside world. Medical support to respond to the COVID-19 and transfer of agricultural technology to resolve the chronic food shortage can be good examples for humanitarian assistance. Human rights situation in North Korea poses very difficult challenges in sustainable North Korea policy from outside world. But the balance between positive incentives and coercive measures is important for sustainable human rights policy toward North Korea. In any case, sustainable human rights policy toward North Korea should focus on how to internationalize the perception and practice of the North Korean leadership on human rights, not to isolate them. Such an approach is likely to facilitate North Korea's willingness to deal with human rights based on the international standard. Let me stop here and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Sound. Yeah, for you also quite deep, in-depth presentation, and thanks also especially for your emphasizing the freedom aspects of this theme. Thank you. And next will be commentators, and as we mentioned earlier, we really promote more kind of international efforts, and so it's really a multi-matter approach. So our commentators from UK, from India, from Russia, and also North Korea. And then our first one will be Ambassador John Everard, former United Kingdom ambassador to North Korea. Each have a maximum 3 minutes is the limited time. Give your comments or one question.
Okay, shall I start? Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for some very interesting remarks from all the panelists. It seems to me, though, that there are issues that are vital to our understanding of the way ahead that we simply have not addressed today. The first is that several of the panelists have tended to talk about reunification of the two Korean states as if this was the fervent wish of all Korean people. I think we have to face the hard fact that it's not, that the opinion polls on this are very clear in the South. This is a battle that we are losing, that a majority of South Koreans feel that unification, yes, perhaps many years hence, but not with my money and not in my lifetime. And until we win the hearts and minds of the South Korean people, we are not going to get anywhere. One of the great ironies of the present situation is that there is much more enthusiasm in North Korea for reunification. Almost all of the North Koreans I spoke to wanted it and wanted it soon because they felt they could therefore access South Korean standards of living. And there's a great imbalance, therefore, between the two Koreas. This is an issue which we must address. Second big issue that we have not really discussed, and which I think changes the dynamic with which we're dealing here, is the pandemic, and specifically the effect of the pandemic on North Korea. North Korea has suffered shocking economic damage because of the pandemic. It's closed down most of its trade. It seems to be causing significant instability at the top of the North Korean regime. Kim Jong-un himself has been absent for long periods this year, and there are now, I think, significant question marks over just how far he exercises complete control, or at least the complete control that he did last year. This is important because it has the effect of significantly weakening North Korea's position. North Korea needs a deal now much more than it did a year ago. It needs massive economic aid. It's getting some economic aid from China, but it's simply not enough to keep the regime stable. And it needs help from elsewhere. I think that if we are ever going to move forward towards reunification, towards a North Korea that is, shall we put it, less painful to live with, then this might be the year of the pandemic. I should like to end my remarks actually by asking Fang Zhu a question. At the beginning of your remarks, Fang Zhu, you said very clearly that given all the historical precedents, it was only natural that China was in favor of a united and prosperous Korea. But is it not the case that although in the last analysis, China would support a united and prosperous Korea, the road leading from where we are now to that outcome is so uneven and so full of risk for China that China is much more likely to prefer things to stay as they are for the time being, rather than embark on what is likely to be a difficult and risky venture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we'll keep all the questions for now. We let every commentators to speak first, and then the speakers can respond to the questions. Okay. Next will be Dr. Jagannath Panda, research fellow and center coordinator for East Asia at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis at Delhi. Dr. Panda.
Thank you, Chair. Very good evening from New Delhi. Let me thank at the outset Mr. Flynn, President, Global Peace Foundation. I also take this opportunity to thank Mr. Intaxio. Also, I thank One Korea Global Campaign and others who are in this panel. Now, this is really fascinating discussion, and we are talking about one of the real complex triangular relationship, US, China, and Korea. Now, I heard these excellent presentations from different country point of view. Let me share with you my point of view on this triangularity from where I do see from New Delhi. I think there are 3-4 critical issues that will be setting the course of the future of the Korean Peninsula, the unification issue, and the entire strategic environment involving the Korean peace process. One, that is the most fundamental issue, is the issue of dialogue. I think if we take into account what has been over the last 2 years, the most important significant issue here is when we have seen a leadership change is going to happen in US, and probably President-elect Biden is going to be crowned very soon and taking charge in the office in the course of next 1 or 2 months. The most important thing here is that whether the US-North Korea dialogue process will continue or not. And I think that will really decide a lot of other things about the next course of action in the Korean Peninsula and the peace process. Now, from where I do see in New Delhi is that probably there will be a continuity, even though in Delhi, many strategic thinkers did not really agree on Donald Trump's administration's policy towards Asia, towards Asia's partners. But I think in Delhi, many of us, we did agree that Trump really did a magic when it comes to North Korea. And I think Trump was bang on target in terms of trying to strike a dialogue with North Korea. And that was probably one of his small foreign policy success, no matter how Americanized this dialogue process was all about, no matter how much it was based on a first America approach. But I think from where we did see, I think he did really score a little, positive things on this aspect. So now the point is whether the dialogue process will go on or not. I think from where I do see, a lot will depend upon how the Biden administration will be looking and how the Biden administration will be really talking with the Kim Jong-un administration. But then this dialogue process is not going to be bilateral. I think South Korea has to play a significant role. And most importantly, China will influence this dialogue process. So the role of China will be critical to what extent the Xi Jinping administration will actually support this dialogue process. The next issue, which is going to be critical in terms of influencing the peace architecture in the Korean Peninsula, is going to be about diplomacy. What kind of diplomacy is we are going to witness? And this diplomacy has to be a consultative and cooperative diplomacy. If we really want to influence the peace architecture in the Korean Peninsula, I think not only the critical actors like US, like Japan, like South Korea, like China, like Russia has to play a significant role, but also I believe the non-critical actors like ASEAN, like India, like Australia, like Canada, like EU, they have to also pitch in and try to influence the peace architecture in terms of participating in a consultative process of dialogue and diplomacy. The third issue,
Dr. Panda, because of the time limit, can you ask your question now?
Okay, so in 1 minute I'll finish. Maybe the two other important issues that needs to be addressed is the issue of disarmament and the issue of demanding North Korea to give up the nuclear and weaponization program. So therefore, I would say that this entire peace process will be depending on dialogue, diplomacy, disarmament, and demand. So my question here would be that whether the critical actors like US, Japan, Russia, China, South Korea would really like to see non-critical actors' participation at some stage, and to what extent Xi Jinping administration and Biden, the elect president, will allow non-critical actors like ASEAN, India, Australia, EU, and Canada to take part and influence the peace process. I thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Panda. Our next one will be Dr. Vladimir Ivanov, Senior Associate and Director for the Moscow office of the East-West Institute. Dr. Ivanov.
Dear organizers, dear panelists and participants, thank you very much for this very comprehensive and highly intellectual discussion with highly professional panelists and commentators. Well, let me focus on just a couple of things. When we're talking about the road to the unified Korea and denuclearization, we're talking about a stable, controlled process. We are not anticipating, we're not wishing a violent conflict on the peninsula or around it. So one of the key values in this process is stability, which at the moment, although fragile, but it does exist, and it does exist, well, actually since the end of the Korean War, more than 60 years ago. In the current situation of the world, this process is challenged. This stability is challenged because of many factors, many fundamental factors, but there are also some recent two factors that I wanted to point out, which are endangering or has endangered this stability. One is COVID-19. The situation when many countries are facing this difficulty with the pandemics, some of the actors are trying to seize the opportunity of changing the balance in their regions. Like, for example, the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm taking the post-Soviet space in the Caucasus. Just recently, this war took place between Armenia and Azerbaijan, with active Turkey participation in the region. I'm just mentioning it as a possible example. Another recent factor is the Trump administration period with a leader who was not consistent in many of its actions, but also intentionally tended to dismantle many of the previous collective security agreements, including the strategic and regional levels. And especially the situation with the elections in the United States create a vacuum of power in many regions of the world. And that's why those events in Europe has taken place. And I'm thinking on how the current transition from the Trump administration to Biden administration and the COVID, in this sense that I mentioned, could influence the military and political stability on the peninsula and around it. Talking about the military control situation, I wanted to mention the example of the Soviet Union, which was a major nuclear power. And we're now talking on the Korean Peninsula of the situation with North Korea, which is de facto, as it was mentioned by many participants, is a nuclear power. And we need to approach it as a de facto nuclear power. You remember that the arms control situation when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it didn't just collapse because of the pressure from the West or arms control or dire economic situation, but for various domestic factors. But the critical point there for peaceful transition was the system of arms control agreements. The SALT treaties, the anti-ballistic missile treaties, and many others. And it was sustained by the international community, including such major power as the United States. So what I'm calling for is we need to think when we are talking about the Korean Peninsula on how to shift from the earlier experience of carrot and stick policies with regard to North Korea to some more sophisticated collective security and arms control diplomacy. When we go into reaching agreements between the powers involved on controlling the arms race in the region, including the nuclear arms systems. And exclude any factors which we may consider as risks to this stability. And here I wanted to just mention a couple of...
Oh no, Dr. Ivanov, sorry, the time goes very fast. Can you also ask your question?
Yeah, so the question is, I wanted to mention the missile defense policy of the United States pursued particularly under Obama, which included the CARD system deployment in the region and the so-called left of launch policies, which is the covert operations by the US cyber operatives trying to undermine the North Korean capacity to launch their missiles and conduct their tests. So do you consider, well, those who can respond to this question, do you consider that this missile policy by the United States, if it is pursued under the Biden administration, could be a significant risk to stability, as thought by many participants of the process, like Russia or China? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ivanov. And final commentators, Hyun-Sung Lee, yes, from North Korea. So Hyun-Sung. Hyun-Sung?
All right. It's an honor to attend such an important meeting. Thank you for sharing your valuable opinions. I'm a North Korean defector. Along with the tension between the US and China, I think the North Korea nuclear issue and the unification of the Korean Peninsula have faced very difficult challenges. I believe that common pressure and contribution from the United States and China can solve the North Korean regime's nuclear development and human rights issues and achieve peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. Of course, the purpose of what the US and China is trying to achieve on the Korean Peninsula might not be same, but as far as I know, there may be at least one common purpose. It's the opening up of North Korea. China has called on North Korea to reform and open for more than 3 decades. North Korea's current and past leaders have said that they would reform and open up responding China's demand. But they have not kept their promise yet because they firmly believe that they cannot maintain the regime if North Korea reformed and opened. Kim Jong-un has also met with Chinese President Xi Jinping 4 times and said he would learn and follow China's path, but there has been no hope of reform and open up. I strongly believe that the Chinese leadership should join forces with the United States to make Kim Jong-un accept reform and openness under maximum pressure instead of calling for opening with a nice word. I don't think the previous economic cooperation is working, and I recommend China should force it to open up. Unless Kim Jong-un has the will to open up or unless Kim Jong-un has the will to open up, lifting sanctions will never lead to reform and open up North Korea. Also, China should remember that Kim Jong-un killed his uncle who was trying to open North Korea in cooperation with China. So I have a question for Chinese panelists here. Couldn't Chinese leadership cooperate with the United States to impose more aggressive sanctions and pressure on North Korea to open up? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Hyun-Sung, for your very brief and clear comments and questions. Okay, so it seems that there are 2 questions kind of more particularly targeted. So Ambassador Emperor's questions to Dr. Zhu. Yeah, maybe Dr. Zhu, can you respond to that question? Dr. Zhu, are you there? If not, and then how about Dr. Wan? This Hyun-Sung's question to the Chinese panelists.
Yeah, I could try to address some of them. I think the North Korea issue is being there for of nuclear proliferation, that we need to try to get the Korea Peninsula nuclear free. That's a common objective of all of us. But I think that we also have to consider that the economic prosperity as well. So we don't want to really unilaterally or one-sided to do that, because it seems never working. That kind of unilateral pressure. I mean, you see that in Syria, you see that in Libya, you see that in Iran, you see that in Iraq, you name it. We see that kind of pattern happen in the past. So unilateral pressure. If you totally restore a regime, but what's the replacement? What's the new mechanism? So while we are not going to risky, in such a very prosperous area of the world, we probably, this kind of incremental approach is more relevant. So China is actually quite forthcoming. I mean, at a national security conference, I mean, a few years back, China actually voted in favor of U.S. Economic sanctions. But I think, we also have to make sure that things is not totally one-sided. We have to really take into consideration the regional issues, into the people of both Koreas, and also the stability of the region. That's fundamentally important. And also, I mean, North Korea probably also not seeking regime changes as well. So I think there's it's not the easy issue, just, you apply maximum pressure and things will get resolved, like Afghanistan, I mean, so many, 20th century, 21st century incident like this. We haven't really seen any peaceful, optimal outcome. So this is a very complicated issue. I think that China, US, and other countries should really work together. Absolutely, China and US should work together. So it probably, it's good to have both Korea and China, US talk on that. Have a four-party talks if necessary, so that we can really get all the things, all the major players involved. Because US has a massive troops in South Korea, China is bordering North Korea. Both Korea has a strong economic ties to China. US has a big influence there. Why not we have four-party talks? And then let's solve that issue and put everything on the table. So that we need the transparency of that. We can't just have one party talk to another and then the other parties in the dark. So I think, probably the best approach, I mean, I hope on the Biden administration comes up, let's have a four-party talks maybe to solve that. So I'm just saying on my personal observation, I'm not representing any official point, but I think that probably could be a approach to do that, and given the consideration of all the complexity and find a way to economic prosper. I think fundamentally, the reunification path is really into economic integration. That would be really the future way to go. I think that is really way to secure the peace and the stability. Yeah, that's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wang. And now we have very, very limited time, so maybe any speakers, if you want to react to any questions very briefly, maybe you just go through. Dr. Song, do you can you start first?
Okay, thank you for giving me a chance to respond to the questions. I absolutely agree with Ambassador Everett's view on the kind of a little bit of skepticism on the unification from the Korean people. But I would say that does not necessarily mean the indifference of the Korean people in the issue of the reunification. That rather says the importance of peaceful coexistence of the Korean Peninsula and between the two Koreas for the time being. So unification itself is not an imminent issue for the Korean public. Rather, thinking about how to bring about the very useful and desirable conditions based on which we can pursue unification as a long-term goal is important. Several years ago, when the previous administration raised the issue of unification preparation, the Presidential Committee for the Unification Preparation was organized, and it was there was a fever of unification all around the Korean Peninsula, of course, in South Korean side. But very few people talked about how to get there. Nobody was interested in how to get the goal of unification in practice. So now is the time, now is not a time to talk about the unification itself. I think rather it is time to talk about how to build up a permanent peace process and peace regime on the Korean Peninsula as a basic precondition to go to the unification of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Song. And Dr. Kwok, can you actually respond to Dr. Panda's question regarding those non-six-party talk nations engagement? How's your view on that?
Well, thank you, Victor. Thank you for giving me opportunity to respond some of the discussion comments and the questions. I my uh, my perspective on the Korean unification has two kinds. One is de facto Korean unification. It means Dr. Sung briefly mentioned peaceful coexistence between two Korea. And the second concept of unification is de jure legal institutional integration of two Koreas. I think a legal integration is very difficult, but at least we expect the de facto unification. And responding to Dr. Panda, I don't particularly do not favor six-party talks. Instead, Dr. Wang's suggestion that four-party talks is preferable because we had, Dr. Sung already mentioned, we had back in late 1990s, there was the four-party talks for about more than 2 years, and 6 times. Four-party talks met 6 times, and but failed. But we can resume four-party talks, which I mentioned in my presentation. What else?
Okay. Maybe
Dr. Everett. Yeah, I may probably answer some of those questions and the comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dr. Bosco, can you react to answer Dr. Ivanov's question on the more on the securities side, or some other things you very briefly?
Well, I think he was suggesting that the United States consideration of a policy of left of lunch deterrence is a dangerous one. Unfortunately, the argument can be made about almost any approach that has been taken with North Korea in the last few decades, that it presents a danger, including, for example, making concessions and offering all kinds of incentives for North Korea to cooperate. Those have not led to successful results either. And some people accuse that of being an appeasement or accommodationist approach. So I come back to what seemed to be working at the beginning of the Trump administration, the maximum pressure campaign. I believe that if applied as well to China because of its subversion of the and undermining of the sanctions against North Korea, I think that is the most productive approach going forward.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Dr. Bender, yeah, please go ahead.
You're asking me?
Yeah, do you want to answer any question?
Yeah, I think these are all very good questions that could take quite a bit of time to discuss. To my mind, it's unrealistic to expect China to act in ways it doesn't perceive as being in its interest. And I'm very skeptical that it intends in the near term to work with the United States and apply very serious sanctions against its neighbor, because from its standpoint, at the moment at least, it has no reason to cooperate with the United States on an issue of security. Reunification obviously is up to the Korean people. The practical strategy to put together North and South is not an easy one. What's critical is to allow those countries to make that decision and allow the peoples to make the decision they see best. And issues of missile defense, et cetera, all of these have impacts. To the extent there's missile defense, the North Koreans may view that it makes more sense to try to increase their arsenal to overwhelm any missile defense. On the other hand, there's a good argument for having some protection against incoming missiles. So, these are practical issues that are being debated, often by strategists in terms of military issues.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank all the speakers and the commentators. And then actually, maybe I want to ask Mr. Jim from you have some final closing remarks, or Dr. Liu, Jim?
Sure. Let me just first of all thank our expert panelists and discussants for a very informative and worthwhile discussion. We've had a large number of people joining and listening in on this, and I think those who have not had time to study the issue learned a lot through this forum today. I also note that these discussions always run out of time and require much more in-depth discussion. What we are hoping is that as we go forward, we can organize more in-depth discussions in more of a working group type of format, and would hope that our panelists might consider joining us for some of those more in-depth discussions. Again, thank you very much for your participation today. It was really helpful.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Dr. Liu, do you have some comments or no? I know. It's muted.
I also like to express my gratitude for all the participation. I'm partly a bit troubled with a statement about how China is a capitalist and no longer can be called a communist country, or the possibility of a peaceful coexistence with a communist regime. I don't know. I have not been so, but with the increasing time, passing time and my age, perhaps, I am becoming a very staunch anti-communist. Come to a view that peaceful coexistence with the communist system is not possible. Any negotiations or treaties with them is meaningless. And I think ultimate dissolution of Communist Party is the only way out of all this trouble.
Okay, thank you very much. And actually, our next event will be on December 4th on the topic of human rights. So also welcome all of you to join. And as Jim said, this is an ongoing effort. We have a working team for different area issues. So you're all welcome to be a part of this ongoing effort. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.